the cold, hard truth about fat burning. Why your body is smarter than Instagram. Or, as I like to call it, how I spent an entire winter losing my dignity in a pile of snow. But before you think, oh no, Leah's about to tell us another one of her epic fail stories, don't worry, I absolutely am. But today, you're also getting some seriously badass science. And I mean seriously badass science, not that Instagram pseudo-crap. So, confession time. I once spent an entire winter sitting in my backyard snow pile for 20 minutes every morning. Every single day. Why? Because I thought I was melting fat like butter on hot toast. Spoiler alert, the only thing that melted was my dignity, when my neighbor caught me blue-lipped and chattering, asking if he should call an ambulance. I'm sitting there like a human popsicle, probably looking like I'm having some sort of existential crisis, which, let's be honest, I kinda was. And this poor man is genuinely concerned for my mental health. Can you blame him? But here's the plot twist that's going to make your metabolically curious brain do a happy dance. While I was completely wrong about the fat burning part, I was accidentally stumbling onto something way more fascinating. The real science of cold exposure isn't about torching calories, sorry Instagram influencers, but about triggering this incredible cascade of hormonal changes that could literally revolutionize how we think about metabolic health. So, grab your favorite warm beverage, ironic, I know, and let's dive into what the research actually says about cold exposure fat burning and why your body is infinitely smarter than any wellness guru's promises. All right, let me start with the hard truth that's going to save you from my snow pile mistakes. Cold exposure is terrible for burning fat. I know, this goes against everything you've seen on social media, but the data don't lie, and neither do I anymore. Well, after learning my lesson the frozen way. Here's what the research shows us. In one study, they took 15 overweight adults and exposed them to cold water suits for 10 consecutive days, 1 hour per day, cold enough to induce shivering. Sounds like medieval torture, right?
The results? Fat mass did not change significantly. Let me repeat that for the people in the back. There was no significant change in fat mass. Kind of demoralizing, isn't it? But wait, it gets worse. Or better, depending on how you look at it. The study showed that while metabolic rate increased at least 50% above baseline during cold water exposure, you could get more bang for your calorie buck by just walking. Even light walking at 3 miles per hour uses about 3 metabolic equivalents of rest, which is significantly more than the cold exposure. This is when I realized that my daily snow-sitting ritual was basically the metabolic equivalent of a very uncomfortable, very cold walk to the mailbox. My thyroid was already struggling, my energy was tanked, and here I was adding more stress to my system for essentially zero fat-burning benefit. Facepalm moment number... oh, who am I kidding? I've lost count. Let's just call it facepalm moment number 847 in my wellness journey.
But here's where it gets actually cool. Here's where the science gets genuinely exciting, and where my accidental snow experiments weren't completely useless.
While cold exposure might be a total dud for direct fat loss, it's a metabolic game changer in ways that are far more sophisticated than simple calorie burning. The research reveals that cold exposure triggers massive shifts in signaling lipids, basically fat-based hormones in your blood. In one fascinating study, they exposed 64 adults to 2 hours of cold exposure near their shivering threshold and measured the changes in their blood chemistry. The results were tremendous. We're talking large shifts in derivatives of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, changes in endocannabinoid signaling, and so much more. But here's the really cool part. Pun totally intended. Cold exposure activates brown fat tissue to release more myrisin, which decreases inflammation in the liver and whole body. Now, let's talk about brown fat for a hot minute. See what I did there? Unlike the white fat that most of us are familiar with, brown fat is metabolically active tissue that generates heat and burns more energy, providing some protection against obesity. Here's where it gets really interesting. White fat, the more typical fat in adult humans, can actually take on brown fat properties in a process called browning or beiging. The research shows that cold exposure increases expression of genes in brown fat that convert the long-chain omega-3 fatty acid, DHA, into the hormone myrcene, which is released from brown fat to signal the liver and whole body to reduce inflammation. This is when I had my big aha moment. I was thinking about cold exposure like a calorie-burning furnace, when I should have been thinking about it like a hormonal reset button. My body wasn't just shivering, it was literally rewiring its inflammatory response system. Mind blown. The timing game, or how I sabotaged myself. Here's something most wellness influencers won't tell you. Timing matters more than temperature when it comes to cold exposure benefits. So, when should you not cold plunge? First, 4 to 6 hours after a workout. You actually want an inflammatory response post-workout, especially after weight training, and cold exposure might dampen muscle gains. Second, shortly before bed. It ramps up your nervous system and may make sleep difficult. I learned this the hard way when I decided to do ice baths right after my evening workouts, thinking I was being super efficient. Not only did I sabotage my muscle recovery, but I also spent hours lying in bed feeling like I'd consumed 47 espressos. My sleep tracker looked like a seismograph during an earthquake. Just these crazy spikes and dips all night long. My poor Oura ring was probably like, what the hell is wrong with this human? The fish connection. Here's a fascinating piece of the puzzle that most people miss. Eating fatty fish with DHA omega-3 might increase myrcene levels and enhance the anti-inflammatory effects of cold exposure. Remember how cold exposure converts DHA into myrcene? Well, if you're not getting enough DHA in the first place, you're essentially trying to make a smoothie without any fruit. After learning this, I started timing my salmon dinners strategically before my cold exposure sessions. Did I feel different? Honestly, it's hard to say definitively, but my inflammatory markers did improve over time, and I like to think my well-fed brown fat was throwing a little metabolic party. I'm imagining my brown fat cells with tiny party hats celebrating all that DHA. Don't judge me. This is how my brain works. What cold exposure can and can't do. Let's get real about what cold exposure can and can't do, based on the actual science. What it can do: trigger beneficial changes in oxylipins, activate brown fat to release anti-inflammatory compounds, improve blood glucose and triglyceride levels, create a challenge response that triggers adaptation, potentially improve cardiometabolic health. What it can't do: significantly reduce fat mass through calorie burning, replace the metabolic benefits of regular exercise, work as a magic bullet for weight loss. The research suggests that if you're already metabolically healthy, you might get more benefits from cold exposure than someone who's struggling with metabolic dysfunction. It's like a positive feedback loop. Being healthy helps you get even healthier. The Reset Protocol. Based on the research and my own trial and error journey, emphasis on error, here's a practical approach to cold exposure that actually makes sense. First, start with your foundation. Before you even think about cold exposure, make sure your basics are solid. Adequate sleep, 7 to 9 hours. Balanced nutrition with sufficient omega-3s. Regular movement and exercise. Stress management. Second, time it right. Avoid cold exposure 4 to 6 hours post-workout. Don't do it right before bed. Consider morning sessions for the alertness boost. Third, focus on consistency over intensity. You don't need to torture yourself with ice baths. Even cold showers can trigger beneficial responses. Fourth, support your omega-3 status. Include fatty fish, algae oil, or other DHA sources in your diet. Fifth, Listen to your body. If you're dealing with thyroid issues, adrenal dysfunction, or other metabolic challenges, cold exposure might be an additional stressor rather than a beneficial challenge. The bottom line. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Cold exposure isn't a fat-burning hack. It's a hormonal optimization tool. The benefits are real, but they're more subtle and systemic than those dramatic before and after photos suggest. Your body is incredibly smart. It responds to cold exposure by activating brown fat, releasing anti-inflammatory compounds, and triggering beneficial changes in lipid signaling. These effects might not show up on a scale, but they could be improving your metabolic health in ways that matter for long-term wellness. My personal reset moment came when I stopped chasing the fat-burning fantasy and started appreciating cold exposure for what it actually does. Support my body's natural resilience and recovery systems. My energy improved, my sleep got better once I fixed my timing, and my inflammatory markers showed improvement over time. Your Reset Challenge. Ready to experiment with cold exposure the smart way? Here's your action plan. Start small. Begin with 30 to 60 seconds of cold water at the end of your shower. Time it right. Morning sessions, away from workouts and bedtime. Support the process. Include omega-3 rich foods in your diet. Track what matters. Monitor energy, sleep quality, and how you feel later than just wait. Be consistent. Aim for 3 to 4 sessions per week rather than daily torture sessions. Remember, you're not broken if cold exposure doesn't melt fat off your body. You're just working with real science instead of Instagram science, and that's actually way cooler. What's your experience with cold exposure? Have you noticed benefits beyond fat loss? Send me a DM or drop a comment on the blog post. I'd love to geek out about the real science with you. That's a wrap. For today's episode, remember, you're not broken. You just need a reset in expectations. I'll catch you next week with more science-backed wellness content that actually works with your biology, not against it. Until then, stay curious, stay warm, and maybe, just maybe, skip the snow pile.